Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
People operate are just glorified plumbers, right?
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. Today's topic, surprise, surprise. And I'm going to tell you, this is Alan Miller speaking, by the way, that we could not have done in the past what we just did now. We had 3 guests scheduled for today. It's also next to the last day of the legislature. So we had a new guest, Senator Matt Klein, who is sitting right here. And the third guest had to cancel because the House of Representatives is meeting earlier than the Senate is. And then we had another guest scheduled who's been here probably 3 dozen times, and he's a constituent of Senator Klein. So he said, wow, can I sit in on this interview? And you don't say no to a former Supreme Court judge of the state of Minnesota, especially Paul Anderson. So thanks to our volunteer crew and thanks to the crew from Eagan TV, the professionals, for rearranging the set at the last minute. And we now have 3 people here where we were going to have individual interviews with only 2 people. Welcome, Senator Klein, for the first time. And if we're making you a little crazy, I apologize. And welcome back.
You know, Alan,
Justice
there are
Anderson.
a few alternative facts buried in what you last said. Not that many, so I'm not going to challenge them, but I just, let the audience know is that there are occasions where you can come on with a few alternative facts.
Well, we do that on occasion. We have a lot of training watching the federal picture.
Okay.
Now, you said when you heard that Senator Klein was going to be here, you said, I'm a constituent of his, and I'm very impressed by him. Can we do all 3 of us? Or words to that effect. I said no. The crew said yes, and here we are, all 3 of us a few minutes later. So why don't you, the constituent, ask the senator a question?
Well, I'm going to start with a comment because I'm from the judiciary, and we're very concerned about what's happening to the judiciary budget in both the Senate and the House. And actually, is that Jan, my wife, sent the senator a letter, and I'm just very impressed by the promptness of his response and how he has a commitment to the broad structure of how government works. But that's going to lead me into another question. I'm a lawyer. I think they need lawyers in the legislature. But you are a physician. And there are now two physicians in the legislature. One's Democrat and Republican. Can you tell us what it's like?
Yeah, I sure can. Well, first of all, I thought there were sufficient lawyers within the legislature, so I thought maybe the other trades should have a chance. Yeah, I ran for the legislature, of course, just last year, just elected in November. And when I ran, there were no physicians in the legislature. And I kind of messaged that at the doors, told people that maybe it was time, given our difficulties with health care in Minnesota, that a physician could add their voice to the conversation. Late in my campaign, I discovered that Scott Jensen, a Republican from Carver County, was also running. He was elected.
Who was here about 6 weeks ago or so.
Yeah, and he's a great physician, a family practice physician who runs his own clinic. And we sit 2 seats apart on the Senate floor, opposite parties obviously, but both dedicated to health care and providing health care for Minnesotans.
But when the governor fainted during the State of the State address, the two of you flew out of your seats and ran to the dais and made everything okay again.
The governor thankfully recovered very quickly from that. Yes, I was sitting in the front row and I ran up there. And he went down, and of course everyone was very concerned. He looked very ill, but he's a good hockey goalie, and he sat up about 10 seconds later and asked, "What are you guys doing here?" So he's a tough nut.
So,
I mean, healthcare is one of many issues in the legislature. Are we going to get something done? I mean, I know that's a priority of yours, and so can you explain how you're working to get this whole healthcare issue, which is very much on people's minds, resolved?
Absolutely. Well, there's two things, and I give both parties and both houses of the legislature credit this year, and the governor, for passing some temporary and emergency type responses. We subsidized essentially people's premiums, which were getting too high and out of reach. And we did that emergently within the first sort of couple of weeks of session. And then later in session, there was a reinsurance bill passed, which hopefully will bring down rates for everybody. But we clearly need a more comprehensive approach going forward. I continue to work with other senators and legislators on public option for Minnesotans to obtain health care. And I think if we keep in mind the goal that we are a strong enough and a good enough society to ensure health care for all of our citizens, it doesn't matter whether we go left or right to get there. We can make some good progress. So.
Now, I've heard from our moles in the Senate and in the legislature that, number one, you have been doing a very really hard-working job. I started to say conservative, but I meant convivial. You talk to both sides of the aisle, which has been a problem in this state for probably the last decade, and which results in things like today, where we're trying in the last day and a half, 2 days of the legislature, to jam through things that should have been done over the 4-month term. Also, you're very responsive to your constituents. That's what I call the Jim Carlson method. Answer every phone call, answer every email, respond, and get out there. And I know you walked the district, so you have learned rapidly, and we welcome you on board. Now, as a constituent, what are some of your other concerns, Justice Anderson?
Actually, I have a question and concern. I don't know the new majority leader that well. I've heard from people that he can work with them and you can trust him. Is that true?
Well, first of all, I know Paul Gazelka, Senator Gazelka, was a great friend of my predecessor, Jim Metzen, and historically has worked across the aisle. He's an insurance salesman, which is what my dad was, and when I got to the Senate, I felt like I had immediate connection with him just on that basis. I kind of understand him well, and I have respect for him. He has guided us through this last difficult, tense couple of weeks with a great deal of grace, I would say, and integrity. He's been candid about where negotiations are. I truly believe that he wants to get a solution done. And I guess your question is, can I trust him? I'll find out, but so far I would say yes.
So now I've got where the rubber hits the road question. I think that what I've observed is there's been some overreaching by the leadership on the Republican side in this session. I've been disappointed with how they structured the committees. It's only 34-33 in the Senate, but there's some committees that appear to me to have been stacked a bit. in order to. And the other thing, and I've written on this, I've got a number of opinions, is that how they are bundling policy issues and fiscal issues in what is an omnibus bill or a garbage bill. They're trying to protect, legislation, special legislation, from the governor's veto. But to my mind, under the single subject law, it's not constitutional.
Yeah.
So what do you do when you are a senator and face situations like that?
Well, so you have 2 points there, and I think, from what I know of legislative history, you possibly know better than I do, or you, both parties perhaps have been a bit guilty with this, but certainly committee stack coming out of the gate was not something that I thought was very respectful. You're right. The division in the Senate is 34 Republicans, 33 Democrats. There's a historic rule that you would divide committees roughly on that proportion, and they were not divided.
It wasn't
at all.
divided that way.
No.
And as well as we talk about that, the fact of the matter is that this is a state that says single subject in your legislation, and we have seen that slip away, at least under this Republican majority in the last 4 years, I would say, where people try to do what they do on the federal level, is slip a bill into a 2,000-page piece of legislation that nobody has had time to read. That is not really representative democracy.
It's not, and there's 2 problems with it. One is a political problem, which is that when you talk about money, people can have disagreements without getting too angry at each other. So in a financial bill, if your target is $600 million and mine is $800 million, we can probably meet at $700. But when you throw policy in there, people get a lot more angry and a lot more heated, and their gumption gets up. So it's harder to get to a resolution when you mix the 2 together, and the governor's been quite astute about that. So that's the political problem with mixing policy and finance. The constitutional problem is that the colleagues of Justice Anderson here may deem our bills unconstitutional if we do too much of that. There is supposed to be a separation of policy and finance.
See, but I mean, and I point the finger at you. There are 3 fingers pointing back at the court. I mean, the court has ducked this issue repeatedly, and the last time they faced it in Associated Builders, the court basically said, well, somebody challenges this type of legislation, we can excise and separate the particular provision of the bill that is being challenged. I think that makes the Supreme Court, in a way, into a super legislature.
Absolutely.
Because people get to pick and choose what they're going to challenge, and then the court can excise. That's not the way government is supposed to work.
No,
So
almost gives you a line item veto as a Supreme Court.
you got that exactly right. It gives the court a line item veto depending upon who decides what provision to challenge. That's not the way it should be.
No, it does seem like a sort of a 4th path of democracy, and I don't think that's probably the intent. So,
What has been your biggest surprise now since your election and sitting in your first term of the Senate?
well, I followed Minnesota politics fairly obsessively in the last 10 years and watched your show very faithfully. And when you hear, the big figures on the stage, Tom Bach and others, you tend to assume that Democrats and Republicans truly are always at war, and they sort of hunker down behind their bunkers and point their guns at each other. What's been surprising in the Senate, at least, is that it's extremely collegial, and we worry about what everyone else's kids are doing, and we were quite concerned when Senator Limmer had a heart attack earlier this session. And also discussions really about policy occur on the Senate floor. In between the speeches, we look at each other and say, what should we do about making sure that people can afford health insurance? How do we solve it? And so that's been a pleasant surprise, I would say.
I've got a point of special interest on that when you talk about collegiality. That's the new Senate office building.
Yeah.
I mean, I was chair of the Design Build Committee and put a lot of thought into it. One, to do the restoration of the Capitol correctly, we had to get the senators out of the Capitol. I know that the Republican Party rode into power pretty much saying that this was not necessary. Now I find that some of the bigger fans of the new building are actually Republican senators. But my question is more, it was very purposeful in the design of this building that the senators had to, both Democrat and Republican, couldn't avoid each other. There are occasions in the garage, the elevator, people had to run into. My question is it working? Do you see it?
Let me answer that by first telling you a story. So you know that there are an odd number of senators. There are 67 senators, and the majority party sits in the back, and we Democrats file in the front. And there's these duplex seats, so that you sit 2 to a seat. And because there's an odd number, one person has to sit with the opposite party. And because I'm new, that's me. So I sit with David Osmick, who's maybe possibly the most conservative senator in the legislature, and we get along great. David's a great guy, and we have great conversations. When I'm in the Senate office building, as you intended, I ride the elevator with Mark Johnson. I ride the elevator with Paul Gazelka. As I walk across to the Capitol, we share thoughts. But it could be much more so. I would prefer the arrangement which I think you had initially favored, which is that we would actually have offices right next to each other within the Senate office building and hybridize even more than we do.
But you are finding it is a collegial atmosphere that is partly created by the building.
Absolutely. Yeah, the building is beautiful, and if Minnesotans haven't been down to the Capitol since the restoration, the Capitol itself is worth seeing now that the senators are all kicked out of there with their offices. There are beautiful public spaces and libraries and art galleries, and the rotunda itself is extraordinary. And then the Senate office building is elegant and simple and democratic.
I mean, we did build it on the cheap. I mean, I'm not sure the builder made any money on that building because we watch the cost very carefully.
Well, so far the heat still goes on in the winter and the toilet's still flush, so I'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah. Philosophically, however, there has been a big divide, even with the collegiality and everything that you're talking about, and yet we have had a great difficulty in getting legislation passed, which is what brings us to the end of the term again, and talk of special session again, and work not finished again. How, as a newcomer, do you see that we can overcome this?
Well, I think there's 2 points to make about that. The first is that parallel to what we see at the federal level, at the state level, I think the divides between Republicans that are quite conservative in the House and Republicans that are more business-oriented in the Senate may be greater than what divides are between Senate Republicans and Democrats or the governor. And so I think that internal friction is one of the essential problems, sort of intra-party difficulties in the GOP. The other point to make is that there's a mindset, and I'm new, so it's been surprising to me, is with every bill that passes or every vote that's taken, I think both parties try to calculate how do we make us look good and them look bad on this. And when I speak to my constituents, they almost don't care any longer. They can't, when you say they look bad, they say you all look bad. And they really just want the work done on time.
Which is why the percentage of approval of legislatures nationwide, federal and state, is way down.
Yeah, that's right. And the more we continue to sort of fall into that rut and play that game of see how smart we are and how much they screwed up, Minnesotans just paint us all with the same brush. You all screwed up unless you can get the work done. So we just got to take that attitude to the job.
What about in-state and out-state? The differences there, because there's certainly a different philosophy of the people who live in greater Minnesota as opposed to the cities and the suburbs.
Yeah, and that is a more difficult divide. There's no question, and that's something that I'm going to really sort of learn more about in coming sessions, and how we can sort of bring back the DFL that used to be the DFL, where we were labor, we were farmers, we were Democrats from the metro, and we were able to coalesce and do good things for all of us. And you can tell, I'm sure you can tell too, that coalition is fracturing a bit. And I bet there were a lot of farmers and laborers in the last election who voted for Donald Trump, for example.
I think there's no doubt, and I think statistics prove that also.
Yeah. Okay, but I have another question. When you have fear, you have persons who are concerned about the future, and they're feeling that they're not being relevant, that can sometimes turn to anger. And I think we saw a lot of anger in the last election. It centered around jobs, economic status. Even if people are good position economically, they feel fragile. So, Senator, you've got some really tough issues, cultural, social issues about people's worrying about jobs, health care being affordable, their kids moving out of the rural Minnesota. So,
infrastructure and environment.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things is that I'm not a big fan of the tax break, because I think we should invest in infrastructure. That's just my opinion. But I'm more interested in how you see a way out of this.
Well, I think it's an opportunity. The last election was typified by anger. I think that's exactly the word that expresses what happened electorally. That's certainly the person that was elected, someone who sort of messaged anger at the presidential level. But I'm a great fan of Abraham Lincoln. He's my personal hero, and he spoke about the better angels of our nature. And I think we do return to that. And when we've sort of vented that anger, I think there's an opportunity for us to come back together and form solutions. Everyone agrees, no one disagrees with you about transportation. No one disagrees with you about protecting our clean water or passing bonding projects so that the University of Minnesota buildings stay structurally sound. And I think when we focus on those things that we all agree on,
well, explain something to me, sir. I mean, we have a place in west central Minnesota, and the internet is not very high speed out there.
That's right.
Actually, the internet in the metro compared to what they have in Europe is not that high speed. So how is it that the very people that are elected from outstate Minnesota, you have to tug and pull to get them invested? I mean, how do you address those issues?
No, you're right. And that broadband in greater Minnesota is a huge issue. It's a huge job opportunity. If we talk about why people are leaving out, greater Minnesota, moving to metro areas, one is that you can't sort of build a modern economy in those areas unless you start building broadband, very similar to rural electrification that President Johnson championed in the 1960s. And it's sort of the next big step. Why are my opponents across the aisle dragging their feet on rural broadband? I'm not sure. And you're right, that is a big issue. Hopefully we can bring that vision to the other parts.
I mean,
you're in favor of broadband, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And some of those upstate Republicans or outstate Republicans have to go back and face their constituents. By the way, I should do a little bit of introduction for Senator Klein, who's here for his first visit, but he is a practicing physician. He specializes in internal medicine at HCMC. He's married, he's a native Minnesotan, and he and his wife have 5 children. Ages I don't know.
Yeah, we have 5 teenage children, and I'll tell you one quick doctor story. So I work at Hennepin County Medical Center. I'm a physician there, and I work nights, and I admit people to the hospital at night. And I love that work. I love working there, and I love the patients that I see. When I first was elected to the Senate, nobody where I worked knew that I was a senator. So I would go into my shifts on the night shift, and the patients certainly didn't know I was a senator, and very few of the staff did. So that was kind of nice, actually, get back to a setting where you're comfortable and be sort of incognito. And then the governor gave his State of the State speech, as you mentioned, and he fainted, and there was a picture on the front of the Star Tribune where I was sort of behind him with the Secretary of State catching him, and my cover was blown after that. Now everybody knows who I am everywhere I go. So.
And interestingly enough, I found that the Senator Jensen, who's the Republican counterpart to you, was a very reasonable guy, and we had a really good interview. We didn't have Justice Anderson here, but we'll see what we can do about that next time.
Yeah.
But and you undoubtedly have met and talked with him medicine as well as politics.
You bet. Scott is a great physician, a great guy. He cast a very courageous vote earlier this session.
He went against his party, as a first-time senator. Yes.
And in a chamber where the party is split 34 to 33, that was a bold thing to do, but he did it because he cares about Minnesotans' health care. And I gained tremendous respect for him on that vote. We talk daily. We sit 2 seats apart in the legislature, and we talk medicine like 2 old docs will do, but then we also talk about policy, and we're hopefully going to work together this summer on some ideas to contain costs within healthcare. So,
which we need desperately.
Yeah, none of the solutions that either Democrats or Republicans propose for healthcare will be sustainable unless we actually bring down that cost curve.
I mean, I've long said Medicare for all, I meant to say. Single payer. Why are we the only civilized country that still has insurance companies and pharmaceuticals running our healthcare system, and decisions being made by non-medical people? Makes no sense to me.
Well, it really doesn't, and I think most people are coming to the understanding that we're a strong enough and a good enough nation to ensure health care for all. You know, some people ask me, is health care a right? And I say, I don't really think of it in those terms. I think that, again, we're a strong enough and a good enough nation to ensure it. So do my kids have a right to dinner? I don't know that I consider it a right, but I certainly know that I'm a good enough dad. I'll make sure they have dinner on the table when the time comes. And that's the way I see healthcare in Minnesota. And I think we're going to move towards that. I hope eventually it's a model similar to what we have in our public schools, where you know, there's a basic amount of public education that every citizen is entitled to. And then if you want to spend beyond that and go to a private school or something like that, that's certainly your prerogative. But we will ensure that you get an education. So.
That's why we still have public schools when the whole system doesn't shift to charter schools. Thank you, Betsy DeVos.
That's right.
But that's a conversation for another day.
I'm going to change directions here.
Yeah,
I know better than to being a public servant, whether you're having fun or enjoying the job. But I'm going to phrase it this way. I mean, I found that in my position is that it had a very high satisfaction quotient because you were doing things that, you know, you thought were helpful. I mean, what is your satisfaction? Is it you have a decent satisfaction quotient with now that you're in the Senate?
Well, I appreciate that question. You know, as with any new job, the first month or so, you're extremely nervous and not sure if you're doing the right things, and things take you 5 times longer than anybody else does. But I do believe that I'm getting my feet under me now and actually finding ways to work with people that are senators on both sides of the aisle. And that is what provides satisfaction. That's when you know you can do good on behalf of Minnesotans. I think that's when you're satisfied.
And we're down to our less than 2 minutes. So if you have another question, Justice Anderson, let's do it now. And this gentleman can get back to work. Absolutely.
So, Justice, you're my constituent. And,
Yes.
And you're out of the judiciary now, so you're able to endorse candidates one way or the other. So I should ask you, did you vote for me?
My wife is a big supporter of you, sir. There's no way that I could not vote for you and keep harmony in the House. And no, we did rather extensive examination who the candidates are, and so we cast a very knowledgeable vote, and it was in your favor.
Wow,
I mean, it's. I got to tell you though, in the coming up to the endorsement, my wife was enamored by one of your opponents.
Yeah, and that was the problem, as so often is the case. That was a tightly contested endorsement. We had a lot of good candidates. And it's too bad when Democrats, you know, compete against each other for a single seat when we could use more Democrats everywhere. So.
Well, I will tell you what my wife said when she came home from the convention. Well, my candidate didn't win, but we got a really good candidate.
Well, I appreciate that.
And we've been talking, and we will have another interview a little bit later on with former Justice Paul Anderson, who's now retired since 2013 because of an absurd law that we have here that retires people at 70, and a first-time guest who's got to come back after the session is over, where we can really not sandbag you like we did here with 2 people, Senator Matt Klein of Senate District 52. I'm so glad you could get away, and I know you have to run back right now, so thanks so much.
Thanks, Alan. It's a privilege.
Senator, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.